Okay, welcome back to 1020. Our conversation this evening is focusing on an introduction to poetry and poetics. We want to set the overall agenda, and then we will finish our time by talking specifically about one poem, John Updike's poem, Great Scarf of Birds. We'll be referencing your art text periodically as well, so I recommend that you have that one open. Actually, we'll begin with page 662, so go ahead and go there real quickly. That's the first place that we'll look. We'll also be on 642 and 954 later in the lecture, okay? So let's go to work now. And let's begin, first of all, by pointing out that when we talk about poetry, we are making a distinction between poetry and prose. P-R-O-S-E. Prose. For example, when you look on page 662, you see prose and poetry. Prose, any kind of language that isn't poetry. Got me? So prose, for example, is the paragraph at the top of 662. Poetry is what is not prose. Poetry is a very specific kind of compositional effort in which we are going to try to be very concise, very exact in our language and in our language use. Okay? The attempt in most poetry is to show instead of tell. Okay? So, for example, the greatest poems don't tell us, I love you, 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 but rather show us love in the form of powerful images created through language. Now, when we look at poetry as a study, we basically look at it from two perspectives or two views. We'll talk about it together here, form and content. Form and content, okay? By form, we will mean the way the poem lays on the page. Literally the way it looks, okay? Content, we mean more particularly what the poem might mean. All right? Let's begin with form. First of all, form. We're talking about the organization of the lines and the stanzas. Now let's get some language out of the way here. When you're talking poetics, then there's nomenclature or code language. A line of poetry, I'm with you on page 662. The Houseman poem is My Team Plowing. Notice that this is a poem that is structured in a very specific way. We have a line of poetry, is my team plowing. Then we have 4 lines of poetry, is my team plowing, that I was used to drive and hear the harness jingle when I was man alive. That we call a stanza. A stanza is a group of lines of poetry. All right? Now, we want to point out that when we are reading poetry, we must read the thought and not the line. I'll say this again. We must read the thought and not the line. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, take a look, for example, at the 3rd stanza of the poem on 662. There's 2 ways to read this stanza. One way to read this stanza, the 3rd stanza, is to read it this way. Is football playing along the river shore with lads to chase the leather? Now I stand up no more. we don't want to read this poetry this way. I just read the line, I didn't read the thought. The thought is going to require that we keep reading even though there's a line break. Read it with me and watch how we read it differently. Is football playing along the river shore with lads to chase the leather? Now I stand up no more. In other words, what we'll do is pay attention to the punctuation at the end of lines. If there is no comma or no period, we most often will follow on to the second line, to the next line. Okay, and we'll have a special word for this as we talk about enjambment and stuff later, okay, as you study in your hymnal, okay? There's two kinds of forms of poetry. And early on, we always want to kind of address this. There are traditional forms, and there are organic forms. All right? Now, what do we mean by that? Well, sometimes traditional form is called closed form, and all we mean by this is it's fixed. Fixed meaning there's a certain way or expectation that the poem is being written, and therefore it has to be read with that understanding. For example, look at Shakespeare's sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day on 642. Go there real quickly. We're going to look at this poem several different times. The first thing that we want to point out about this really, really important poem is that we call it a sonnet. Now, a sonnet is a very particular form of poetry. We'll have much more to say about this later. For it to be a sonnet, there has to be several things that happen within this traditional or closed form. One, must have how many lines for it to be a sonnet? How many lines? Well, the answer is 14. For it to be a sonnet, it can't have 10 lines, it can't have 15 lines. It has to have 14 and only 14 lines. Okay? It also has to have a certain kind of rhyme scheme. So, for example, you'll notice that the last word of the first line, day, rhymes with the last word of the third line, may. Do you see this? Temperate lines with date, shines, declines, and so on. Okay? We call that rhyme scheme. That's going to be an important part of understanding as well when we look at poems, all right? Well, what is organic poetry then? Organic poetry or open poetry, not so much fixed rules. For example, take a look at the E.E. Cummings poem on 954 real quickly. All right, 954, one of the great examples of a poet who, who plays the game of organic poetry. 954, spring is like a perhaps hand. Now, notice that this poem has different kinds of line breaks. Do you see that? There's nothing, can I use this word, uniformed. There's nothing uniformed in this poem. Spring is like a perhaps hand. By the way, just so you know, over my shoulder, E.E. Cummings has been watching all along. That's him. Okay, in the far corner, that's Cummings watching all the time, you see, okay? Cummings, one of the great organic poets of all time. If you will, form is kind of looked at from three perspectives. The first is the way it looks on the page, as we've been looking at. The second is the way the poem sounds. What we will often, this is any poem, any poem. Any poem, we look at its form in regards to the way it looks, now in regards to the way it sounds. And this is often what we refer to as poetic elements. Poetic elements, all right? The way the poem sounds, all right? And now I want to go back to the 642 poem, and let's begin by talking first about rhythm and rhyme scheme. Now we're going to have much more to say about this. Again, this is just an introductory lecture, but let's take a look at it nonetheless. Notice Shakespeare's poem, 642, one of the really famous sonnets that Shakespeare wrote. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Now the first 4 lines of this poem can be read the way I just read it. But there's another way to read this poem. It's what we call scanning the line. And that means we slow it down when we read it, and we try to hear the rhythm of the line. Again, I can read it. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Okay, that's one way to read it. But if I slow it down, I can begin to hear something kind of fascinating about Shakespeare's rhythms. Watch. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a day. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Now that is rhythm, okay? And it's a very particular kind of rhythm, what we will call iambic pentameter. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Each one of those ba-bums is what we call an iambic foot. Ba-bum, unstressed, stress. Ba-bum, 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 right? 5 of them, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? 5, pent. Iambic, ba-bum, pent, 5, iambic pentameter. The entire sonnet is iambic pentameter. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. By the way, just to point out to you, the genius of Shakespeare, he writes the entire play, Romeo and Juliet, in iambic pentameter. Ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. Now notice, when I read those lines the first time, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Right? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. You don't hear that iambic pentameter. You'll become a student of hearing this kind of rhythm. And one of the things you want to pay attention to is to pay attention to the meter of the rhythm within the lines of poetry. Sometimes you'll have consistent kinds of rhythm. That, again, is usually what we will refer to as traditional, more traditional forms. Other times, it won't be so fixed, again, more organic. Make sense? Now, notice as well, we pointed out that in this sonnet, you've got rhyme scheme. At the conclusion, for example, of the first line, the last word is day. We will put a little A there at the end of that line if we were scanning this. And then we look at the end of the second line and we recognize day and temperate don't really rhyme together. But notice the last word of the third line, day and may, do rhyme. So what we will do at the end of the second line is write a little letter B there. And then at the end of the third line, we're going to write a little letter A because it rhymes with day. The rhyme scheme of Shakespeare's sonnets, what we call an Elizabethan sonnet, is A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, and then the last 2 lines, do you see it? So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long live this, and this gives life to thee. Notice that C and thee rhyme together. The last 2 rhymed couplets, we'll call them. Okay? And we'll have much more to say about this. I mean, obviously, we're going to exegete this poem in some detail next time we meet, right? Okay, I'm just kind of setting you up for the ways that I want you to begin looking at poetry. There's also within this whole thing of poetic elements of sound the issue of repetition. Sometimes it's repeating words, sometimes it's repeating phrases. You'll see this in some of the examples of the poems we'll study. Sometimes it will be what we call alliteration. That's a key word. You're going to come across it, alliteration. Alliteration, consonant sounds at the beginning of words. Uh-oh, this is that Peter Piper picked a pail of pickled peppers. All those P's, right? That's alliteration, right? Then there's this thing called assonance, repetition of vowel sounds, either in the middle of words or at the end. Consonants, repetition of consonant sounds, either in the words or at the end of words. And again, we'll see some of this, okay? We'll pay attention to some of this. So again, if we're looking at the form of a poem, we're looking at the way it looks on the page, we're looking at the way that it sounds when we read it out loud, right? And finally, we want to think about, in form, the way it works, okay? The way it works will be the language that I will use. And here we're talking about figurative language. Figurative language, that's the term that often is used. You'll notice that's the term that's used in the Updike question, right? Figurative language. Now, what do we mean when we're talking about figurative language? Well, we have several phrases or words that we will reference here when we talk figurative language. Anytime we're looking at poetics, we're often going to pay attention to what we call the simile, S-I-M-I-L-E. When you first see this word for the first time, if you're not careful, you'll think it's the word smile. Simile. And it simply means a comparison within the poem of two things when you compare one thing to another thing. However, for it to be constituted a simile, we want to use the word like or the word as. That we call a simile. Okay? Another form of figurative language is what we call the metaphor. And here we're talking about a comparison, but we're not going to use like or as. Okay? We're not going to use like or as. So, for example, if we were to say of Mr. Haynes, Mr. Haynes is as strong as an oak tree, I've constructed a simile where I've compared Mr. Haynes to an oak tree, and I've used the word as. Mr. Haynes is as strong as an oak tree. If I'm going to make that line into a metaphor, I just simply remove the word as, and I will say about Mr. Haynes is an oak tree. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that he's a real tree, right? That's why we call it figurative, okay? I'm asking that you kind of imagine that in some ways, Mr. Haynes is like, in some ways, comparable to an oak tree, okay? We also have this thing called personification, which I just did with Mr. Haynes. If I were to talk about Mr. Haynes and not call it his arms, but rather call Mr. Haynes his limbs, the limbs of Mr. Haynes as an oak tree. Well, now all of a sudden you realize I'm talking about his arms, but I'm calling them what we would call tree branches. When I give human attributes to non-human things, that we call personification. In other words, I take something that isn't a person or a human, and I kind of turn it into a person, right? Then that we call personification, all right? Finally, one of the other kinds of figurative language games that gets played in poetics is what we call hyperbole. That's just a $5 word for exaggeration. To overstate something is hyperbole. Hyperbole, right. H-Y-P-E-R-B-O-L-E, hyperbole. Something is hyperbolic, that means that it is exaggerated. I'm so hungry, I could eat right? I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Yeah, normally we don't eat horses, and second of all, that's a lot to eat. That's a hyperbole. It's an exaggeration. Poets love to do this kind of game. They do it all the time. We're going to pay attention in poems to the way in which it happens. We'll maybe even see it in Updike's Great Scarf of Birds as well, this kind of exaggeration or hyperbole in play, all right? So again, when we're looking at poems, the first thing we look at is the form of the poem. We'll look at its organization, the way it looks on the page, things having to do with stanzas and lines and this kind of thing, whether it's a traditional or it's an organic poem. We'll then look at the way the poem sounds in terms of poetic elements. We'll look at the way the poem works in terms of figurative language, okay? That's the first way we'll look at a poem. The second way we'll look at the poem is in terms of its content, its meaning. What's the point of the poem? What is it that the poet is trying to say? Now let's be clear. We want to make a differentiation, separation, between the poet, himself or herself, and the speaker of the poem. We won't assume it's always the same person. Okay? So for example, in Updike's Great Scarf of Birds, there's no necessary need to assume that the one speaking is in fact John Updike himself. Do you got me? Okay. Questions, comments? Well, let's talk now about our 3 levels of reading, annotation, and let's use specifically our Updike poem as a way to practice, shall we? So what we'll be doing now is looking at the John Updike poem, The Great Scarf of Birds. And we want to pay particular attention now to how we do our annotations. Remember our 3 levels of annotations. At level 1, what are we doing? Just to summarize? We're just going to provide a summary. We want to be able to say what happens in this poem. That's all. Level 2A, we're interested in what?
what it means.
Messages, themes. What are the points of this poem? What's the meaning? What's the message? Notice that the very question itself asks you about the very end conclusion observation, right? So there's maybe a message or two going on here, right? Wait a minute, what's 2B? What do we call that level of reading? Do you remember? What is the second B, 2B level of reading? We spend a lot of time here. This is the rhetorical level of reading. Not what the author says, but how the author says it. All that information that I was just talking about when we were talking about the form of the poem, the way it looks, the way it sounds, the way it works, that's all 2B stuff. So for example, if notice in the question it asks you to look at things like the poem's organization. Notice, for example, where stanza breaks are on this poem. The diction, that means the word choice that's being used in the poem. And the figurative language. What are some of those elements of figurative language? Simile, metaphor, hyperbole, personification. Guess what? All of those are present in this poem to some degree. We're going to see that, okay? So we're playing the game at 2B of trying to identify what's going on there as well. We're asking, how does the poem work in regards to those elements of form and sound and figurative language? Uh-oh, that's the first two levels of reading. What about the third level of reading? We divide it again into two parts. 3A, how does this poem relate to other poems? Remember 2A,
okay.
Other poems, other texts. Not just poems when we say text. How does it relate to? Movies, books, things we've listened to before. Songs, anything qualifies as a text in here, right? We hold, in our class here, equal all texts, all right? We're going to be able to compare all texts. Got me? Finally, 3B, Mr. Perez, how does this poem or text relate to me personally? Have I ever had an experience like this? Have I ever seen something like this, etc.? All right? All right, with that in mind, now let's go to work. The Great Scarf of Birds by John Updike. Playing golf on Cape Ann in October, I saw something to remember. Ripe apples were caught like red fish in the nets of their branches. The maples were colored like apples, part orange and red, part green. The elms, already transparent trees, seemed swaying vases full of sky. The sky was dramatic, with great straggling V's of geese streaming south, mares' tails above them. Their trumpeting made us look up and around. The course sloped into salt marshes, and this seemed to cause the abundance of birds. As if out of the Bible or science fiction, a cloud appeared, a cloud of dots like iron filings, which a magnet underneath the paper undulates. It dartingly darkened in spots, paled, pulsed, compressed, distended, yet held an identity firm. A flock of starlings, as much one thing as a rock. One will moved above the trees, the liquid and hesitant drift. Come nearer, it became less marvelous, more legible, and merely huge. I never saw so many birds, my friend exclaimed. We returned our eyes to the game. Later, as Lot's wife must have done in a pause of walking, not thinking of calling down a consequence, I lazily looked around. The rise of the fairway above us was tinted, so evenly tinted I might not have noticed, but that at the rim of the delicate shadow, the starlings were thicker and outlined the flock as an ink stain in drying pronounces its edges. The gradual rise of green was vastly covered. I had thought nothing in nature could be so broad but grass. And as I watched, one bird, prompted by accident or will to lead, ceased resting, and lifting in a casual billow, the flock ascended as a lady's scarf, transparent, of gray, might be twitched by one corner, drawn upward, and then, decided against, negligently tossed toward a chair, the southward cloud withdrew into the air. Long had it been since my heart had been lifted, as it was by the lifting of that great scarf. Now, let's point out right away that we are here not to like a work of literature. Okay? In the same way that we all have different interests and tastes in regards to music, right? We're not going to look at poems and decide whether we like them or not. This is what we did when we were a sixth grade. Sixth graders decide whether they like things or not. If I like it, then I'll read it. If I don't like it, then whoa, way wrong answer. We're not here to like or dislike works of literature. We are here, important for your notes, to appreciate works of literature. In other words, we're going to ask fundamental questions about the text and how the text works. Like cuisine or food that sometimes we try for the first time and don't necessarily like. This is true of sushi, for example. But then later, one acquires a taste for. Sometimes the text we'll study will work that way. And we'll actually find ourselves going, it's not bad. But that's not why we're here. Rather, we're here to pay attention particularly to how the poem works. How does it accomplish its poetic mission, as the poet John Updike will create it. Okay? And then ultimately, that's how we will appreciate this work of literature. So, let's work through the 3 levels of reading real quickly. This is what you will do for each one of these texts that we'll be reading. Level 1. This is a poem about what? The speaker, even though it might not be Updike, we'll call him just for, for safety's sake or for enjoyment's sake, we'll call him Updike. Updike is where? What's he doing? He's playing golf. Out on the large fairway, correct? Where all the grass is, right? In the fall.
Or autumn.
Autumn, you got it. Where is he? What part of America is he? Do you have any sense of it?
I'd say New England.
You're right, Cape Ann. Right, that's right, New England, aren't we? Okay? And they're playing golf. When all of a sudden, what do they see? Now, some of us have maybe actually seen this. Have any of you actually seen when birds move in unison and it literally looks like there is some kind of design up there? Now, if you're talking geese, you're often talking about just a few fowl that are in some kind of V shape, correct? But that's not this scarf of birds. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of small starlings that move together, and from a distance, what does it look like? What is a scarf? Yeah, it's a light kind of clothing, right? That when blown in the air has a certain kind of look to it. So, Updike is going to say, in its most simple of language, see, I told you this is an easy poem. This is a poem in which he says, I was golfing and I what? I was golfing and I saw what?
Birds.
I saw a bunch of birds. It was really cool. It was really amazing. End of story. That's pretty much the poem at level 1. It is a very simple poem in that regard.
So you saw birds.
It's a powerful images poem. That's it, right? I was golfing. All of a sudden I saw these birds. I saw them the first time, then I saw them again. And they reminded me of a scarf that one would kind of throw into the air and it would float down gently on the back of a chair, for example. End of discussion on level 1. Let's go level 2. 2A. What's the point of a poem like this? What kind of message happens at the end of the poem? Well, notice what he says at the very end of this poem. Long, line 50, long had it been since my heart had been lifted as it was by the lifting of that great scarf. The final line taking us back, of course, to the title of the poem, Great Scarf of Birds. What does he say about seeing this for a moment?
Reminding him of one of them, somebody that he loved.
It reminds him, what's the literal language from the poem? It lifted what?
His heart.
His heart. Now, does that mean that the birds came and pecked away at his heart? No. See, we're working with figurative language, aren't we? In other words, seeing this phenomenon in nature, which is quite remarkable, does what for him? Makes him feel happy or sad?
Happy.
Really happy. But now why? Why would it make him feel so happy to see this wonderful scene of these birds flying through the air in unison this way? Right. See, this is going to tell us something. Notice what he says. I hadn't had my heart lifted. She said, Miss Trimbat said, maybe he's been kind of sad. He hasn't been doing very well. And all of a sudden, something as simple as a powerful moment in nature can transport him, make him feel good. What are some of the possible messages from a poem like this about, for example, the power of nature to lift the human spirit? What's one possible message? What power does nature have in this poem to help him become more happy?
I think like the color. I don't know. Never mind. I'm not gonna talk. I
Take
think
how
well, like the
unusual
nature,
it
if it's just the color, or
seems.
just seeing the birds and looking up. You know, it was just.
Yes. It startles him in a good or a bad way?
Good way.
In a good way, yes. It gives him a powerful feeling that in some ways he's able to connect with. In the same way that we'll hear from other romantics like Wordsworth, that we can connect with nature and in that process become more human, we might even say. All right, what about 2B? 2B. We ask, for example, about things like figurative language. Do we have any examples of simile in this poem, or examples of metaphors? Are there any comparisons that are made? Well, just take a look. Notice the third line. Ripe apples were caught like. Do you see it? Now remember, there's two kinds of annotation. Internal annotation, marks you make on the actual text. You should be doing that with red ink on this poem. I gave it to you to keep. So you should have circled immediately the word like when you saw it and recognized, what do we call that when we use the word like?
Simile.
It's a simile, it's a comparison. Notice that he's saying, the ripe apples are caught like red fish in nets. That's an interesting kind of simile. We're gonna, what's the most dominant metaphor of this poem? Comparison. The group of birds flying remind him or are compared to a what? What's the title of the poem?
Scarf.
A scarf, a woman's scarf, yes. So that's the simple metaphor, isn't it, right? It's the powerful metaphor of the poem. There's lots more as we are looking in this poem we could go through if we wanted to. Obviously, he's personifying, right, in some ways, this event of these birds, like a scarf, giving them human attributes, right? You have examples of hyperbole or exaggeration that happens several times in this poem as well, right? So, for example, he will mention this story from what we call an allusion or a reference from the Bible, the story of Lot's wife, who at the burning of two famous cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, she turns back to look and is turned into, does anyone know from Sunday school what happened to Lot's wife? She gets jacked. She turns into salt. She turns into salt, a pillar of salt, we're told, okay? And of course, a reference to this is in some ways hyperbolic as well. He says, I kind of felt like Lot's wife. I'm supposed to be golfing and paying attention to where my ball went, and I looked backwards, and bam, there it was. That group of birds by the hundreds lift off of the ground and start moving. I myself, let's go to level 3. I myself have had the experience of several times seeing this in the last couple of years in my walks in the morning to school, to actually see birds moving in this way. It's quite remarkable. At times they become invisible because you're looking at them dead on, and then all of a sudden they turn, and then there's this huge black scarf of birds in the middle of a blue sky set off against the blue sky. Of course, if you were working at 3A, you would maybe make an observation